Perfect. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Really is a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Sandra Smith and I lead our corporate and executive education programs at Brown. Today I am joined by Dr. Robin Rose, who is one of our distinguished faculty members here at Brown University and she works in our leadership programs within our executive master programs, as well as professional and executive education programs. And I also have with me today the great pleasure of having Amol Naik, former partner of Goldman Sachs. Amol brings with him an extensive career, both obviously in investment banking, but also holding very senior leadership roles at Goldman Sachs and at the firm. And what we want to do today is tell you a little bit about our program, Leaders Coach at Brown University, but also want to follow up with a conversation with Amol about his experience, both as a leader and as a coach. What I should also say, and then I'll allow you both to maybe wave hi, is Amol is an alum from our leadership certification coaching program. He has completed the program and is now working also as an executive coach or starting his own practice around that area. So he brings really a great perspective of what coaching skills are and why they're important for leaders in today's day and age. So that's the conversation that we want to have today. Let me pause and see if my guests would like to say anything. Say a wave hello.
Just welcome everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So as we go through this, we'd like to make this as interactive as possible, knowing that, of course, some of you may feel more comfortable using the chat function. So feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A function, but also if at any point in time, I think, yes, if you have any questions, let us know as we go through it. But at the end, we'll also have some dedicated time, a little bit of time at the end for you to just ask open questions. So with that, what I'd like to do now is, Robin, maybe ask you to take us a little bit through the Leaders Coach program and really what motivates that program and what's included, what people can expect to learn.
I think the place to start really is to think for just a moment about some of the challenges that all leaders face. And to say that we are working in and leading in complex times is a gross understatement, especially right now. But and because we're working in a time when the problems and challenges are extraordinarily complex and require adaptation, really, the old paradigm of everybody looking to the leader for the answers is really inadequate. So in coaching, what coaching allows us to do is to help mobilize and engage all employees in the effort to solve complex problems. And it was a really interesting study that Korn Ferry put out not too long ago that said that the results indicate that a very large percentage, like 70% of employees describe themselves as not particularly engaged in their work. That was before the pandemic, so my fear is that it may be even higher, if that's possible now, because of the social isolation that many people are experiencing. So there are a lot of leadership challenges out there, and coaching is not a panacea for everything. It's not an answer for everything, but is a set of skills that enable you to expand your range. And if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of being a coach-like leader. This program is not aimed at certifying you to be a professional coach, but it is focused on helping you to develop the skills and attitudes to be more coach-like, and putting those skills and attitudes in a wider range. It is really important. Obviously, there are times when leaders need to give direction. You need to make a clear decision. You need to give advice or to mentor employees who work for you and with you. But there is something to be added there, a value added in developing coaching skills and attitudes. And that has to do with your ability to listen actively, to ask powerful questions, and to help other people to think critically about the problems that they're facing. And if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, and some other benefits of coach-like leaders, and Amal is going to talk quite a bit about this in a few minutes. There are a lot of benefits to a coach approach to relationships with your employees. One of the things that we know about leadership is that the leaders who are sort of rated by their peers and their subordinates as highly effective are people who are able to balance attention to relationships as well as results. And being coach-like and having those skills really enables you to do both. It's not just about being empathetic and supportive of people, it's also about holding them accountable and working with them to set up accountability. And I think Amal will also talk about that. And I think there's good data to say that, coaching can increase the level of engagement of employees and also help with employee retention, in part because people feel like they are part of the team, that they're part of the solution. One of the things that, before we sort of go into talking about the details of the program, I think that many leaders, we struggle with being fatigued because people are so dependent on us for answers and direction. And that just leads to leader burnout. And one of the things that I love about coaching and being a coach-like leader is that you're really focused on developing the capacities and the confidence of other people. And that's good for everybody because it brings their perspective and ideas and expertise into the mix. And it also helps to prevent burnout among leaders. So if you're interested in developing other people, I think a coach-like approach would be a great thing to add to your toolbox. I think we'll go on and talk just briefly about, Sandra, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I think you said it perfectly well. One thing I would just maybe add color is why we thought this program was important why it was important for us to offer this program now. One of the main reasons is we hear often from leaders in industry that the world's just gotten more complex. No longer can we do work in this authoritarian manner where the leader has all the answers, but work is being done much more in these interdisciplinary teams that are sort of sent into the world to resolve complex problems. And so that really forces a different leadership style that kind of holds those teams accountable, but also has the right tools, including the things like powerful questions that really get those teams to produce the best outcomes and the best solutions on their own. So I think that is one of the reasons why this program, although coaching is one of many skills that, of course, a leader can have, coaching has become an even more important tool. And we'll talk a little bit more about an example of, for example, at Goldman Sachs, how coaching has become a really important, if not the way in which the leadership development is being thought through. So just adding a bit of the rationale for the program.
That's great. So let's talk for a few minutes about what the program contains. If we can go to the next slide, Esther. And Sandra's going to walk us through the specifics, but there's basically 4 sessions. And in the first one, we're really focused on coaching foundations, sort of why coaching might be important to your leadership. What's the difference between, for instance, coaching and mentoring or coaching and advising? How do you build or increase the safety and trust between you and an employee, whether that's a peer or somebody who reports to you or even somebody to whom you report? And also in that first session, we talked a fair amount about the mindsets or attitudes. The way we think about things, the attitude we have about things really has such a powerful impact on how we behave. So if our attitude is that if I don't do it, it's not going to get done right, or, my employees, all need me to direct every action that they're taking, that's your mindset, then it's hard to be coach-like. So we spend some time talking about sort of what is your mindset in terms of the attitudes you have towards others. In the second session, we focus much more on skills, and there are a number of skills, but we've mentioned a couple times powerful questions, open-ended, powerful questions that get people really to think for themselves, as opposed to giving them a solution for a particular problem. So listening skills, open-ended questions, being able to bottom line, help somebody come to a conclusion and be really clear about it. We also talk about the arc of a coach-like conversation, sort of like what are the things that are included in a coach-like conversation. We'll talk a little bit about the model that we are in partnership in this program. We are in partnership with an organization called ACT, and ACT, the acronym stands for Awareness, Choice, and Transformation. And our goal in having a coach-like conversation is to help somebody be more aware of the attitudes and the impact that the attitudes they have and the impact that they're having, so that they can be more clear. They can be clearer about the choices that they make, so that they're more thoughtful about how they show up. And in fact, that becomes transformational. And we also talk about values during the second session. In the third session, we're focused on what we call the reactive to creative model. About 70 to 75% of us spend most of our time in what we call the reactive space, where we're reacting to threats that we perceive, either because we want our relationships to be perfect, or because we want to be in control of things, or whether sometimes, if we feel insecure, we might feel like we have to be the smartest person in the room. Those are all sort of that falls into the category of self-limiting beliefs and reactivity. And our goal in leadership is trying to help people be more aware of whether they're coming out of a reactive state, and how can we help people move to a more creative place in the work that they do. And a big skill and concept in that is reframing. So how can we reframe how we think about a problem, so that we can function in a more creative space. And then finally, and we also talk about sustaining, like how do you sustain those kind of practices? There's a big emphasis in this program on application. This is not all just theoretical with people talking at you, and Sandra's going to talk more about sort of the pedagogy of the program. But in the last session, we talk about sort of how do we apply all this, how do you integrate it into your leadership style, and how do you go about having really difficult conversations with people, which of course all of us have on a fairly regular basis. So that is just a thumbnail sketch of the content. Sandra, I'm going to invite you to jump in here as somebody who's been through this. Do you have any other comments you want to add?
Yeah, no, maybe I'll make my comments as I describe the next slide,
Okay.
if I may. Thank you, Robin. That was great. I think it's a very good overview of the content. May I have the next slide? Perfect. So actually, this is not the slide I wanted, but this is a bit of a overline. Is the program starts in March 17. It goes through April 28th. We'll talk about what's included. There's some asynchronous learning in between. You can see it's really 8 weeks long. We're asking a commitment of about 4 hours per week, which most of that is in between weeks is very flexible according to your own schedule. And then the tuition is right there. So may I go to the next slide, and I can walk through. Before we have our conversation with Amol, I just wanted to punctuate what Robin described by saying that the program is just extremely experiential. So what that means is that, as you can see here, we have a series of live online sessions that are mostly about 3 hours long. The first one's 3.5 hours because there's so much material to content. And what those sessions look like is there's some small, initially about a 35 to 40 minute of content being discussed, but the remaining of it is in 100% what we call demos. So that's where people are actually bringing real issues in front of the class and getting coached in front of the class and getting feedback, and then separated in diets. So what you're experiencing then is exposure to leadership problems across multiple industries by people that are all coming from different angles. But mostly what I think a big takeaway from cohorts as we run this from people from different industries is how similar the problems really are, regardless of the industry that you're in. How it is that this kind of human struggle of leadership has some very similar components, no matter what, if you're an IT person in a pharmaceutical company, or if you are a mid-career leader at a bank. It's really amazing to see how the lessons and the learnings in your laboratory can be really relevant. So this is the schedule. As I mentioned, in between those sessions, what we have is homework assignments where people are asked to work in pairs, they're assigned in triads, and that really becomes a place where you do a lot of this experimentation, but that also is happening during the class. So extremely experiential, extremely real life is what I would call this curriculum. Maybe we go to the last part, which is we just ran a cohort. There were about 22 people from 5 or 6 different industries. The evaluations were extremely positive. I think 100% of the respondents in the survey that we fielded agreed that the skills were applicable to work. And the program received on average about a 4.5 out of 5 in terms of overall satisfaction. So it really, I think, could be an important investment in someone's career, particularly if you're finding that you're curious about what this approach to leadership might be like, coach-like leadership. What I want to do now with that is really pause and transition the conversation to really a dialogue with Amol and Robin, because what we want to do is kind of give you some real life examples and also an opportunity to ask questions yourself. So once again, if you have any questions, I guess we're not using the chat feature, we're using the Q&A feature. So feel free to send them to me and I'll try to get them to you or get them to our guests here. So let me start maybe with a question for you, Amol. In your experience, Goldman, which I think is most of your career, you were there for how many years?
23.
23 years. So some might call you a survivor, or certainly. What would you say are the key attributes of effective leaders? And more specifically, what are the coach-like characteristics that you see in those leaders, or you saw in those leaders?
So I guess the first thing I would say is, in my observation, the most effective leaders that I saw during my career at Goldman Sachs, or for that matter, my observation of people who have had successful careers in the financial industry, 2 things. One is they are not only good at driving commercial outcomes, but they also build followership. And I think the most effective leaders do both well. If I try to think about what is an effective leader in my mind, and from my experiences of having worked at Goldman Sachs for 23 years, effective leaders have a very crystal clear vision. They take an expansive view of the role. They articulate their vision really well. They care about people. They have a reputation for caring about people. They are role models and they exercise prudent judgment. And when I think about all of these, they're really coach-like characteristics. And, if you're trying to say, for example, develop a strategy or have a vision, it's not an epiphany. It doesn't just pop up in isolation. You have to maintain a dialogue with your stakeholders, with your teams, be able to listen to inputs that are coming in from them when you're trying to develop your strategy or vision. When you think about people and if you watch people's backs, if you empower them, if you nurture them, they give their best to you. I mean, I look at my own example. I worked for somebody for a long time, and I have seen my ex-boss fight for people, fight for their promotions, fight for their compensation, nurture them, and we all gave our best to her. Even to this day, I mean, we both no longer work at Goldman Sachs, but I still seek out counsel and guidance from her as well. And so, being somebody who cares about people, in my mind and my observation, is what differentiated effective leaders. In terms of judgment, if you're trying to make judgment, there's no black or white in at least my experience in financial services. Everything is gray. And so you're trying to make judgment calls. You have to make sure that you can see all perspectives and all the different inputs on the table, even if those points of view may be different than yours. In fact, one of my big bosses that I had the privilege of having a lot of access to, he was remarkably good at listening to people, particularly when you had a different point of view. He even listened more intently because he wanted to know why you had a different point of view. And so when I think about all of these attributes of effective leaders from my observations, that, when I first, joined the firm, people didn't use the term coach-like leader, but that's what it was. And over these years, that whole structure has been much more formalized, as we may talk about a little later. And the other thing I would say, and the last point I would say, is as I got more senior, it became even more important to be coach-like, because when you're leading senior people don't want to be handheld. Senior people don't want to be spoon-fed. They want to be, given the autonomy, the freedom to drive the outcomes. And I think the importance of coach-like leadership is a necessity once you are actually leading more senior people. I think that's one of the key observations that I had from my own experiences and what I have seen really successful people in our business.
So Amal, let me jump in here and ask another question, which is that, you said the senior people don't want to be handheld. They don't want to be told what to do, whatever. Can you say a little bit more about how do you see coach-like leaders or coaching connect? Is it in any way associated with actual business outcomes? What's the connection there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a place like Goldman Sachs, it's all about driving outcomes. And so if people are focused on coach-like leadership, it's because it helps drive business outcomes. It's not just a nice thing to do. It makes commercial sense. If like, I always tell people there are only two ways in which you can scale your commercial impact. One is through technology and the other is through people. And as it relates to people, the only way in which you can scale yourself is by making sure you're leveraging people in the right way. In my 20 plus years of experience in financial services, I would say the only thing that I have seen that was constant was change. Otherwise, things are constantly changing. The only thing that was constant is change. And I've also seen my share of financial crises, in the last 20, 25 years. And the most effective leaders are the ones that can manage change and the one that can actually manage through a crisis situation as well. And so what does it mean to drive successful outcomes with a coaching style of leadership? When you're making business decisions, as I said earlier, are all gray. And there is, in most cases, no right or wrong answer. And so therefore, if you're trying to make smart business decisions, it's important to make sure that you are creating an environment which is a safe environment for people to disagree, to be able to flesh out the issues on the table, look at the pros and cons, the risk reward trade-offs. And I think in order to create that type of a dialogue with your stakeholders, you need to be a leader who's able to create an environment that facilitates that. I think Robin mentioned earlier in the introduction of the program about asking powerful questions. In my mind, as I started to get more senior, I realized it was not about finding answers. It was about raising the questions and making sure that your teams were able to find the answers. One, because there are only so many hours in the day that you can work, and so you have to extract leverage from other people. But two, also because when you empower people to find the solutions and be creative, they actually are much, much more excited to drive the commercial outcomes as well. Mm-hmm. And then, when you empower people, when you give people more freedom, they are much more proactive versus waiting for the leader to give the sort of direction. Mm-hmm. And the more you create an environment where people are more proactive, the more you're going to be able to get stuff done, the more people will be excited to get it, to the right sort of business outcomes. I guess I'll give you one example. After the 2008 financial crises, particularly in the financial sector, there was such a dramatic change in the business environment, a dramatic change in the regulatory agenda, and things were like moving in so many different directions. And, as a firm and as an industry, to respond to some of those regulatory changes, there was no way you could do that effectively by having a top-down diktat kind of style. And so the most effective way in which we saw being able to respond to that was being more bottoms up, being more entrepreneurial, empowering people to come up with creative ideas, solutions to what the changing landscape and the regulatory agenda was. Now, clearly you need to have a structure in place so that it's not a free for all. And so there has to be some way to reconcile a top-down approach to a bottoms-up approach. But the real ability to scale and be able to drive those outcomes in a situation when there were so many changes happening in the regulatory agenda, it was very important to sort of be more bottoms up. And as I think about it now, it was such a coach-like leadership approach. I don't think I defined it as such when I was going through that 10, 15 years ago. But as I think about it now, that's such a coach-like approach to being able to deal with business outcomes.
Well, thank you. It's so fascinating to hear you kind of speak about that very difficult time in all of our lives and industry, and how that bottoms up approach is facilitating through this style of leadership. I want to maybe take up a question that we got in the chat for you from Chantal, where she says, thank you, Amol. What was the biggest transformational takeaway you've experienced during the program, the LPCC? Something transformational that may have surprised you and struck you long after the program?
So, and Robin was one of my instructors, and so I have a huge admiration for Robin. What I observed is that being able to have the right balance between driving things versus coaching people to drive things was supremely important. I mean, I wouldn't claim to have been the most effective leader, but I improvised over a period of time. I wish I had done that program like 10 years ago. I think I would have gotten my balance between what some people call producer manager, or some people call coach, versus, actually being in the weeds and driving things. I would have gotten that right. I don't think it was that wrong. I did reasonably okay in my career, but I would say that balance of when you are relying on others to a great extent versus when you're actually diving in, that's one thing that I actually learned a lot through the program.
Thanks, Amol. And that's actually a good follow-up or tee-up to my next question, which is, we've been talking a lot about coaching and how it helps drive results, in this case, kind of the resolution of how to get out of a massive financial crisis. Can you talk a little bit more about then that other side of the equation? How does coaching, a coaching approach to leadership, help in motivating employee performance? So individuals, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, somebody once said, people don't leave firms, they leave managers. And I'm referring to firms that are doing reasonably well. In a firm that is performing reasonably well, when you see a lot of, voluntary attrition, it's actually not surprising that people leave managers and not the firms. Now, research suggests that, but also from my own empirical observations, when we used to have people leave and we would do exit interviews, you start to realize that actually people are leaving their managers more than they are leaving firms. And, I also used to, tell people, you never want to be surprised when someone comes and says they want to leave, because if you were surprised, then you weren't actually keeping a two-way dialogue with them. Now, people are never going to be entirely transparent, but you don't want them to be entirely opaque to you either, that you really don't know what's on their mind. And so in order to be able to be effective, having a coach-like style where you are keeping a two-way dialogue with them, you're listening to them, you are giving them an opportunity to express their point of view, express their frustrations, empowering them, creating a safe environment, I guess is a nice way to describe it, is supremely important. Because if you do all of those things, people tend to be more excited and motivated. And even when I think about, in the financial services industry, where people just assume that everyone only works because they can get more money, that's actually not the case. People don't necessarily leave just because they're going to get paid more. There are many reasons why people might leave their roles. And in my experience, people tend to leave their managers more. And so therefore, if you can create the right kind of style of how you're able to deal with your teams, I think you can create a lot more excitement and motivation for your people. I guess if you look at any high-performing organization, at a minimum, they need to have high-performing people. And if you want high-performing people, you need to basically make sure that you are, treating them like high performers and high talent individuals.
That's excellent. And speaking of high performing organizations, I know that Goldman Sachs recently launched an approach to performance management that is kind of focused on empowering leaders as coaches. Can you talk a little bit about that program and your experience with it?
Sure. I mean, the program was launched last year when I was no longer an active, partner at the firm, but I have seen the LinkedIn response that was put out by the global head of HR, as well as I still know a lot of people. And, when I look back at a place like Goldman Sachs, it's a place with a lot of talented individuals, high performing people. And therefore, the approach to leadership has always been coach-like, as I described earlier. It's much more formalized, it seems like to me now. And the way the structure works, as I understand it, is, managers will design their business objectives and business plans along with their employees, with their teams. And then people in their teams have the accountability to drive the outcomes. Clearly, people will leverage, their managers leverage upwards as appropriate. But people have accountability to drive those business outcomes. And then, those plans may be modified as time goes by and as environment and factors change, but keeping that two-way dialogue allows you to do that. And then also having an objective in mind that you've set up front, you can measure performance of how people have done versus those objectives as well. And so to me, this is a little more of a structure and much more formalized arrangement of a more coach-like leadership style. But from my own experiences, even before this structure was formally launched, we did really have a coach-like approach, and I think it's, in my observation, one of the more effective reasons why we have been able to do well.
Thank you. That's really interesting, Amol. Maybe here in kind of our last minute or last stage of our structured discussion, we can ask you to just kind of reflect back and see if there might be any words of wisdom or advice that you might give people who are aspiring to move up in their leadership careers, regardless of the stage that they may be at.
Sure, I'm happy to give my 2 cents. I don't know how much of a wisdom it would be, but my 2 cents. I mean, the first thing I would say is I would just reiterate what I said right at the beginning, which is the most effective leaders are not only good about driving commercial outcomes, but that they are also about building followership. And even when I look at my own career, people ask me, what are you proud of? I'm proud a lot about things that I did, but I'm also proud about the people that I led, the careers that I helped shape, the people that I nurtured, and many of them I'm still very close to. So I would sort of just reiterate the need to build followership and not just focus on driving results. Mm-hmm. I guess if I was to offer any 2 cents, I would just sort of say, develop a style which allows you to leverage people to the fullest potential. Every individual is different. People have different strengths. Try to leverage people's potential, leverage their strengths. Solving business problems, you can rely a lot more on leverage from your teams in solving complicated business problems. The leaders who try to assume that they have to solve all problems, I think Robin used the term leader burnout. And the more you can leverage people to help solve problems, you may be accountable for them, but help solve problems with that leverage will certainly help. Empower people, watch their backs. The one thing I would also say is praise people too, by the way. There's not enough praise that goes around. We tend to be quite easy giving constructive feedback, but I think praising people is important, as important as, giving constructive feedback. So those are the few sort of, 2 cents that I would share. But the one sort of thing that is stuck in my mind is one of my mentors once told me, you're only as good as your team. And so I would say just, coach them to be their best.
Nice, Samuel. I have one last question. Thank you for that parting, which would have been probably a great place to stop it. But I have another question from Tom Laird that I wanted to put out for both you and Robin, which is a program intended, because I think it's very interesting, given the comments you just made about your life at Goldman. The question is the program intended to help develop leaders and leadership skills, which I mean, it seems like it's about more of a basic program, and less about instructing experienced executives to be better one-on-one mentors. So is there, I think my answer is a bit of both, is both, but I want to throw it out there for others. So
yeah, I think it is both. I mean, you know, we've had great success. I just want to back up and say that this curriculum, this program was developed by Mike and Erin Hutchins, who are the co-founders of ACT. And they have utilized this offered this program. They do a tremendous amount of work with the federal government, all different agencies within the federal government, as well as with corporate groups. And I think that the curriculum allows for sort of a range. I mean, we've had people who have been, you know, CEOs of large corporations and organizations, and people who are more in the mid-range of just, you know, they're in fact, you know, sort of in the middle of their leadership journey. I think that the program makes room for a space for people at either of those groups. And Sandra referred to this earlier. I think one of the things that's been interesting to watch is that people who come from different kinds of organizations and industries, you know, sometimes we have this assumption that, well, what can I learn from so-and-so because they're not doing the same kind of work that I'm doing. But the reality is that the challenges, leadership challenges and problems are quite similar across a lot of different types of organizations. So I think there's room in the program and room for growth and learning for people at the highest levels, as well as people who are in more of the mid-range of their leadership journey. That's my take on it.
Yeah, and I might add that it also distinguishes, I think, Tom's question about mentoring. I just want to pick up on that. I think one of the things that the program does is really make a very specific distinction between mentoring and coaching. And I think getting clear on both are valuable, but when you are in a coaching conversation versus a mentoring conversation, and there are different sort of rules of engagement per se, or at least a mental frame that both the person doing the coaching or doing the mentoring can have, and then the person on the receiving end as well. So one of the probably a really powerful skill that we haven't talked too much about is this idea of co-creating the relationship, which is really all about being about a lot more intentional about designing the kinds of interactions that you're going to have with people on your team and the kind of relationships. So one of it could be getting really clear on what it is that I'm doing with you. Do you want me to be your mentor? Do you want me to be your coach? Let's actually talk about the differences between those two, so that both parties are entering that in a much more conscious way. Right. And that allows for more productive interactions, and also less confusion and misinformation or miscommunication. So I think that's another part that the program, I think, touches on Tom's question.
Sandra, can I add one thing? You know, when I did the leadership and performance coaching program, there were about 16 of us in our cohort. And if I recall correctly, there were only 2 of us in financial services. And so, commenting on what Robin mentioned earlier, that was my first experience of doing a leadership program where there were people from outside of the financial services industry. I've done a lot of leadership programs, but they were entirely with people who were like me, who had spent their career in financial services. And in the program that I did with Brown and ACT, there were people from hospital management, technology, from academia. And when you do a program where there are people who bring very different experiences to the table, you know, some of the perspectives, it never even would have occurred to me had it not been for the fact that there were people who were coming at the same question in so many different ways. And that I found the sort of leadership sort of program experience quite different because of that. And so I just wanted to echo that.
The other thing that I would add to that I think really enhances the connection among folks in the program is that when you're practicing with each other, you are not doing role plays. You know, one of the sort of requirements of the program is that you bring some topics, some leadership challenges or professional challenges that you're dealing with to the mix, and then you practice these coaching skills with each other. So I think the fact that the content of the practice sessions is real helps participants really develop a nice connection to each other, and it makes it very real and very applied.
Well, thank you both. I think we can stop right here. And thanks, Chantal, for your last comment about your experience in the program. I really appreciate you all joining us today. We will share the recording with folks who were here today and also with folks who weren't able to make it. But let us know if we can answer any questions about the program or the process. We are certainly excited about the next cohort and look forward to having those of you who are interested in joining with us. So thanks again, and thank you very much to my special guests, Amol and Robin, for being here with us today. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.